Okay, so I'm gonna make this guide for a couple friends that I know that I've been having conversations with over the past like week, and I'm just gonna compile it all into one video. And this is gonna be put on the YouTube channel because I think a lot of people can benefit from this. So we have our connection types here, ranging from the fastest to the slowest. We're gonna ignore this one right here because these four are the most common. So I used to have DSL internet, and now I'm on fiber, and basically satellite will be the slowest with the highest latency, and fiber is going to be the fastest with the lowest latency. So the type of internet connection you have does play a factor in what ping you do get to servers. For example, when I had DSL, I had 66 ms to Hypixel and 66 ms to MMC. And now that I have fiber, my ping to Hypixel is 20 and my ping to MMC is now 43. Because fiber is the fastest and newest, and if you had something like DSL like I used to have or satellite, your experience is going to be much worse because that's just an older technology. So while your actual internet up and down is mainly determined by what type of connection that you have, the latency on your connection is a very important factor here. As you can see, my base ping is 7 milliseconds, and when I max out the download, it adds another 8 milliseconds to my connection, and if I max out the upload, it will be 19. So the reason why the latency on your connection matters is because when your speeds are maxed out, basically take whatever numbers you get on your up and down and add that to your overall, base ping, and that will essentially be the ping that you'll be seeing in game. Now, another thing we need to go over is basically your ping to your Minecraft servers that you play on. So for example, I get 20 ms to Hypixel. So ping is basically a measurement in milliseconds, which basically indicates how far you are away from the servers that you're playing on. So that means your ping should really never change. So if I refresh, you can see my ping does not change. It stays within that margin of error of like 1 to 2 milliseconds, and it does not change. This means that if your ping fluctuates in game, it is an indicator of an unstable connection, which could be that added latency that I was talking about before that's being added to your connection when your internet usage, in this case your speeds, are being maxed out. There are ways you can stabilize your connection if you do not have, for example, fiber in this case, and you're using something like cable or DSL. The quick rundown to that would be that you need to get a third-party router and basically limit the up and download speed so that they never hit that max usage, therefore never adding that latency to your connection. This is a whole nother topic, and it requires purchasing equipment, so we're not going to get into that here. A lot of people talk about DNS, and basically what DNS will do will not really make your ping better or worse. It will just kind of improve the snappiness of things, and that's really almost about all that it does, besides like the other like talking points that doesn't really affect us in this scenario, so we're not going to get into that. We have two main providers that you will most likely be using if you do change your DNS. Those will be Cloudflare, which is the first one, and the second one will be Google, which is the second one. Basically, to decide what DNS server is best for you, whether it's Cloudflare or Google, you're going to run a ping command and ping 1.1.1.1 and then 8.8.8.8. And basically, as you can see, Cloudflare is good for me because it gives me single digit response times. Google gives me around that 16 to 17 millisecond range. So in this case, I would be using Cloudflare because it is fastest for me. So now we are in the NVIDIA control panel setting, and most of these you can just use default. It doesn't really matter, but if you are going to change settings, there are three things that you need to be aware of. The first thing is your threaded optimization. This is the big one. So for Minecraft, you need to keep this on auto if it's global, and if you want to turn it on, because for everything else it should be on, but for Minecraft it doesn't really work. I can get into that why, but basically all you need to know is that it reduces your FPS because Minecraft's not coded in a way to where it can take advantage of those multiple threads. And that's why it reduces your FPS, because it does more work and all that stuff, right? That's kind of like the general rundown from my understanding. So you're going to want to leave this on for your global. And if you want to keep your global on, then you need to go to your program settings and turn that off. Another thing you need to know is your power management mode settings. Basically what this does is just runs your GPU at your basically boost clock at all times, and it doesn't down clock. And the only reason why you would do this is because it gives you a little bit less micro stutters. If you're having that problem, it should kind of 99.9% of the time fix that, because your not fluctuating in clock speeds and stuff. And the last one is your low latency mode, which Minecraft doesn't have this option in the game. So turning this on does reduce your FPS by a little bit. But since it's not a competitive game, you're not going to ever need this. And most competitive games that you play, example Fortnite, Valorant, will just have it in the game and it will overwrite this setting anyway. So you should just keep this off anyway. So basically with your power plan options, it's the same thing with your NVIDIA control panel settings. If you put it on balance, your CPU just kind of fluctuates between, frequencies as it sees fit, and that's why it balances your performance and energy consumption. That's what that means. If you use high performance, basically those fluctuations will be less, and the only reason why you'd want to change this in your NVIDIA control panel settings is because if you have like micro stutters, that could be caused by those fluctuations in frequencies. So if you have those problems, you can turn on high performance, and it might give you a little bit of latency difference because you're getting slightly higher frames, stuff like that. That's basically what those two options do. Now, there are a few BIOS settings that you can change, and these will directly affect your FPS in-game and basically everything that you do on your computer. And the first one is what everyone knows, is to enable your XMP profile, which just basically makes your RAM run at its rated speed. Everyone knows this. It should already be on, but if on the off chance it's not, there you go. Another one is your multi-core enhancement, and this is I think a ASUS only motherboard thing, where basically it takes all your cores on your CPU and will allow them all to boost to I believe it's max turbo boost instead of just maybe a 1 or 2 cores, right? So if you have that setting, turn it on. That's basically what it does. The other setting is removing power limits. Basically, if you do any things like rendering or literally anything CPU intensive that like requires 80% plus usage all the time, removing the power limits will basically allow your CPU to run hotter, which is one thing. And two, since it's consuming more power, it takes those frequencies on your clock speed. As you can see, mine's locked at 4.9, but let's say it wasn't locked, because I have it locked for a reason, but let's say it wasn't locked, it will allow those frequencies to stay up higher and for long. And the last thing is, if you have an NVMe storage device that is running in X2 mode, it basically will half your speed. So for example, I have a Gen 3 Samsung NVMe that's 1 terabyte, as you can see the name right here, running in X4 mode, because that will basically give you your full actual like speeds of your NVMe, which improves your loading times in games. So basically, the next thing we're going to talk about is how your in-game settings kind of affect your FPS. And if you have even a mid-range PC, you can be running optimized defaults, which is like pretty much maxed everything, because the only main factors that are really going to make like a huge play are your render distance and your performance tab. And other than that, I mean, the game is pretty easy to run. So most of you, if not 99% of you, can run like these settings that I'm using all the time, and you should be fine. Of course, if you turn them all the way down, you will get the higher frames, but like for the most part, your game can look pretty good, and you should like still be getting insane FPS, quite frankly. The main thing that's going to really affect your FPS is, of course, your render distance. You can use that on 8, you can put it on 12, even 14, but I don't think Hypixel supports that. But most people can just use 8 and be fine. And if you really want to, 12. But I like mine on 8. The next thing you're going to change is obviously your performance settings. So if you hover over them, they will tell you what each one of them do. But these are the settings I like to use for the FPS, which is obviously fast render, fast math, dynamic updates off, lazy chunk loading on, these two on, smooth world. Actually, I keep on. But yeah, these are gonna make the biggest impact on your FPS. So next, and the last thing, is gonna be your memory allocation. So as you can see, I have 6 gigabytes allocated in my game, and basically what that does is well, we already know what it does, but I'm gonna kind of explain it a little bit differently, right? So most of your game settings, if not all of them, are kind of tied to your memory because of how the game's coded, obviously. So a lot of things here, and what you want to do, because it's all mostly personal preference, if I'm being honest, are just basically what you want to run, and then based on that will determine how much RAM your game's going to be used. And it's really the same thing with Lunar Client as well. So let me explain. So if you want to run higher render distance, you obviously need more RAM, and if you want your game to look good, you're obviously going to need a little bit more RAM. So I'm going to explain to you and kind of demonstrate exactly how this works, right? So the easiest example I can use is with Lunar Client, because a lot of people use Lunar Client. I think some of you guys have been switching to Forge, but doesn't matter regardless. Most of your in-game settings and your Lunar profile settings are all personal preference, and a lot of these things are optimized to where they don't really affect your FPS that much, besides from like the obvious ones. Your lazy chunk loading, things like that, you can change, and it basically just, if you want your chunks to load fast or slower, therefore providing a higher FPS boost. TLDR is that the more quality you want your game to look, the more things it's gonna kind of do with memory, right? Therefore, your allocation is gonna be a little bit higher. For example, Lunar Client defaults at 3 and it recommends 4, and that's assuming you run like kind of potato settings, right? 4 gigs will be fine. And if you kind of turn down your stuff, right? If you turn your stuff a little bit upward, higher quality rather, your RAM usage is going to be a little bit more. So another example I can show you is all these cosmetics that the game, renders in the client is all loaded into memory, right? So if you turn all of these on, which are on by default, your memory usage will be higher every time you see somebody with cosmetics because it's being loaded into RAM. So if you were to turn all of these off, your RAM usage would actually be low. A lot of things, like I said, are personal preference, but the higher you turn up, the more RAM it's going to consume, and that's kind of how you determine how much RAM you want to give Minecraft. For me and the settings that I'm running, the game tends to like to use about 6 gigs, so that's why I allocated 6 gigs to it. I've tried 8, it doesn't reach that. 6 is basically the sweet spot. And basically, how you can tell how much like RAM your client needs, if it needs more, is if the number you allocated is being shown in Task Manager to be using way more than you gave it. So for example, my game's only using 4 gigs right now, and I have allocated 6, which means I have plenty of headroom. I'm also in a super flat world right now, but if I were to go on Hypixel and start piddling on that server, the RAM usage would spike to, I'd say, about 5.5 gigs, and that's where the 6 allocation number comes from. So the last thing I want to get into here is OBS and basically video compression for the people that do live streaming and YouTube videos. And a lot of this stuff is very, very simple. You just have to understand how it works. So for example, we'll do live streaming. Your encoder basically is going to use, if you have a modern, any sort of GPU, so like 2060 up basically, you're going to use your NVIDIA card. And because it actually has a separate encoder on it right here. So like my video encode right now is being used. This is a whole like separate part of the card. And this is for if you're watching videos, and this is for what games are rendering and stuff like that, right? So that's basically why you use your NVIDIA graphics card. The hit to your FPS isn't like very much. It's very, very minimal actually. So for live streaming, you're going to use your bitrate because your bitrate is or constant bitrate instead of CQ, because it's going to be measured in your upload speed, and this determines your quality, and your rate control will always determine your quality. Everything else is basically how you want to compress your video. So for example, when you use stream on Twitch or YouTube, Twitch's max is 6 kilobits, which means it's going to be using 6 megabits of your upload speed, and everything here is just going to be how you compress your video to Twitch. So the simple explanation is all these settings that you tune here to use the absolute max does all the compression, all the video compression before it gets sent to Twitch on your hardware. Therefore, it makes your quality better. If you put this all on the lowest and stuff like that and use, just basically the loosest settings possible, your quality is going to suffer, and it's basically sending the largest file size over to Twitch. So you basically want to compress the video as much as possible on your end using your hardware, in this case your graphics card, before you send it off to Twitch. And that is what all of these settings basically do, is the file size to quality ratio, or the quality to file size ratio rather. How much quality you can stuff in as little of a file size as possible. That's basically what all of these settings do. Live streaming, your key interval, it says that 0 is auto, but for Twitch and YouTube, the recommended is actually 2. So if you don't get any encoding overload, just turn it to P7. And if you do get encoding overload, just slowly, lower it by 1 and see which one works. Because you want this as high as possible without lag. Your tuning, you can keep this on high quality. Your multipass mode, you're going to want to turn it to full resolution. If you get encoding issues and this is on like maybe P3, you're going to want to look at this next, maybe turn it to quarter resolution. Your profile, you're going to want to keep this on high. The difference between high and baseline is mainly a newer NVIDIA card thing. I'll explain that here in a second. Your look ahead, adaptive EQ, or adaptive whatever the word is, right? I can't talk. You want these two checked, and your B frames, the max you can use are 4. So these are basically the best settings, which does all the compression on your hardware level before sending it off to Twitch. And this is why your quality will actually improve if you can, if your hardware can handle it. Now, same thing with recording. We're going to use our NVIDIA card because it is the fastest encoder, and everything else here, if you know what you're doing, you can change it, but most of you will keep it on default. Your rate control, we're going to use a CQ level of 18. This range on here, you can use anything as low as 15 or anything as high as 24. But most people, if not everyone here, should be using 18. If you have better hardware, you can use 15, but the quality difference is very, 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 very minimal. So it's better to just keep it on 18. Your rate control, because we're not live streaming, you can set this to 0. And your preset here is exactly what you're going to have to tune on your own time. But if you want the loosest settings possible, which will give you the largest file size, because these are local files stored on your drive. Let's say you have a 2 terabyte drive, you can use, you can basically make it as inefficient as possible. So you can use preset 1, you can use single pass, you can use profile baseline, and stuff like that, right? But since I fine-tuned my settings that work with my hardware, I am able to use preset 4 and profile main. Everything else here should be unticked because your rate control is already enough to basically perform all the quality, stuff like that. I am recording at 1080p, 480 FPS, as you can see up here, with 0 encoding lag on these preset 4 and profile main. But I do know that if I try to change this to high or higher this, anything to like P5 and above, I do get encoding overload. So the sweet spot for me for quality and file size is using CQ18, preset 4, and profile main. I will experiment with these other options later, but for the most part, they don't really need to be checked. Now in your advanced tab here, you really shouldn't have to change your process priority, but if you for some reason have issues, can change it. I don't recommend it because most of the issues you will have will just be a output and coding issue rather than anything to do with your process priority. So I would just keep this at normal. Color space, you should keep this on 709. You can use sRGB, but 709 works fine. Color range, basically, if you keep this on limited, it keeps your colors as default as everyone sees them. But if you turn it to full, it can make your videos look darker, which some people prefer. I sometimes prefer it, so that's why if you see some Minecraft videos with a little bit darker colors, it's because they're using color range full. Your color format, I cannot change it right now because I'm recording, but NV12 gives you the loosest colors and the fastest. But if you wanted a slightly more accurate colors at the cost of encoding performance, you can use, I believe it's I444 color format, and this will give you a little bit more accurate colors, but this is not something a lot of you are going to be using. It's really, really small, but I thought I'd just mention it. So